and welcome to our show, And Now You Know, a show that strives to enlighten you with information that can better your life, because the more you know, the better. So our episode today is Remembering is Learning, and we have a special guest, Jeffrey Armstrong, a psychology professor. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So tell me, you've been a professor of psychology for quite some time. What inspired you to get into this field?
Sure. Well, since our topic today involves learning and memory, I will share two memories. The first is when I was in high school, I read a book called Ordinary People by Judith Guest, and it was my first exposure to mental illness, and it really had a major impact on me at the time. And second, I think of my third semester in college at Penn State. I took my first psychology class, and that class affected me enough that ultimately I decided to change my major to psychology.
Interesting. So, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about learning today, and I just want to talk about the proverb, learning is remembering, by Socrates. So he said that learning is all about the soul remembering certain things. So after all these years, what can you tell us about this from a more psychological perspective?
Sure. Well, learning is remembering. It acknowledges a really important part of the process, but I would say it's an incomplete view of the learning process. I'll give two examples. So first, think about when you first learned to walk. You probably don't actually remember it, right? But it is still a memory, because you can walk now. And second, I think of, for example, I think of learning as also being about doing. If I had to have open heart surgery, I'd be really concerned if the person who was going to perform that surgery had never actually done it before, if he just remembered the process. So a lot of the times, learning is also practicing or doing.
Interesting. So tell me more about the average age that people start remembering, and walk us a little bit through the process of remembering.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. When you ask that question, I think you're probably referring to what we call episodic memory. These are memories of our life's experiences, and they require conscious recall. And there's a lot of research on the topic, and most of that research converges around the ages of about 3 to 4, that we don't really remember a whole lot of our life's experiences before that age. But I would expand the definition to include memories that don't actually require conscious recall. So again, think about our motor skills, like being able to walk. You learn to walk in your first year of life. Even though you don't remember it, it's still a memory. And so I think the real answer is that we actually start learning or remembering at the very beginning of life, and quite possibly before we're even born.
Interesting. So I guess our audience is familiar with short-term memory and long-term memory. So what is sensory memory?
Sure, yeah. So these stages of memory are part of a theory by Atkinson and Schifrin called the multi-store model. And sensory memory is an immediate momentary impression on our mind of our sensory experience. So for instance, if we just hone in on one sense, our vision, right? Sensory memory is kind of like a photograph of what we see, but it only lasts for just a moment, less than a second. And then after that moment, what we remember in terms of visual information is kind of fuzzy and blurry. So for just a moment, we're able to hold on to kind of a perfect impression of our sensory experiences.
Okay, so how does that information make it to short-term memory?
Well, first I would say that the overwhelming majority of that information doesn't make it to short-term memory. Just a very small amount does. It's pretty simple, actually. If you start thinking about an experience, then it's in your short-term memory. As soon as it becomes this conscious thing that you're thinking about, then that really is what your short-term memory is all about.
Okay, so how much sensory info can our memory take at once?
Yeah, so I mean, sensory memory is incredibly large, and so every moment we're taking on a huge amount of information. But in terms of how much of that is actually passed on to our short-term memory, it's very limited. Again, this is not a perfect rule. There are many exceptions, but in general, we like to think of it as about 5 to 9 pieces of information, especially if it's new information, at a time. So for instance, if I were to say 15 random numbers right now, you'd have a really hard time probably trying to remember all 15. If I only said about 7 or so, think about the length of a phone number, you'd have a pretty good chance of holding on to them and that information being able to stay in your short-term memory.
Okay, so how does short-term memory go to long-term memory?
That's a good question. It depends. If you're engaged in an experience that is really meaningful to you, like your wedding day, you probably don't have to try to remember that necessarily. Experiences will be remembered just because it's so impactful and meaningful. Same is true for really stressful or traumatic experiences as well. But for experiences that are less meaningful or more mundane, if you will, We have to maybe try or practice to remember. So think about students studying information. They have to repeat or practice that information so that it sinks in and ultimately, hopefully, it gets stored in the long-term memory.
That's true. So now that we know the basics of memory, can you tell us how can we apply this to learning new skills or information on a daily basis?
Sure. Yeah, I think I always go back to the tried and true rule here of spreading out what we learn, and this is part of what we call the spacing effect. Our memory is incredible, but in order for it to work its magic, we need to spread out the learning process and do it over a longer period of time. So cramming just doesn't work. There's tons of evidence to support that. The other thing I would add to that is sleep is also a really important part of the learning process. So spread out the learning process and get some rest.
That totally makes sense. Thank you so much for joining us and discussing this new information. It was really helpful.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So there you have it. This concludes our episode, Learning is Remembering, on And Now You Know. Hopefully you remember what you've just learned. Thank you for tuning in.
Messages in this world we're reaching out to me. I can